So today we're going to take a look at The Ego Trick by Julian Baggini. Hopefully I pronounced his name right. He is a professor, he has his PhD in philosophy, and so this comes from more of a perspective of a philosopher rather than the self-illusion, which I reviewed a few weeks ago, which was written by Bruce Hood, which comes from more of the psychological-oriented angle. One of my criticisms was what of Bruce Hood's book was that what he did was kind of just reference a whole bunch of psychological studies and how they tied in to identity. I think Julian Baggini's book does a much better job actually exploring the ideas about identity in their kind of staying within the realm of like what he's talking about. And so, okay, let's go get into it. The book has like basically three sections. The first section lays down a bunch of background conversations, kind of talking about what is conventionally thought of in terms of identity and what people think about identity. And the big one that he kind of settles on and says this is the normal view is the Pearl sense of self. And in that, you kind of have one essential nature that is not mutable, that defines you-ness, and this is your core self of who you are, and that, you're not that subject to context changes. You're the same person over time. And the three chapters in this section are bodies of thought, so he's covering a lot of the thinking behind it, identity on the brain, memory makers, and soul searching. Okay, and so in one of these chapters he talks about transgenderism. He jumps into that a little bit. Another, he talks about, I think he references like Phineas Gage, for example, is a nice example from psychology. He's a man who he works on a railroad. One day when he's nailing some dynamite into a hole, the dynamite goes up and it shoots like a railway spike through his head, and it just goes right through his skull. And what it pierces the frontal lobe that kind of holds all of your ability to like not engage in rational thinking, but your ability to restrain yourself. And so Phineas Gage goes from being this sort of reserved, mild-mannered person to just being this outrageous, like, fighting in bars and, like, this type of thing, type of guy. And so the question is he the same person? And if he's not, then it's, something about the brain damage that makes him a different person. And if he is, then how can we explain this dramatic change of behavior? And so one of the really essential elements in terms of identity, at least for a lot of people, is the presence of continuity over time. And so as long as you're the same, as long as you can in a narrative way connect all your past selves in a narrative that you tell yourself, you're considered the same person. Well, then Julian Baggini brings up the point of, well, what about Alzheimer's? When you stop being able to track yourself over time, who you were, and like this sort of thing, are you still the same person? And so it's like nailing down what makes a person the same person, or what gives you identity, is incredibly hard. And it's incredibly hard when you're operating from the perspective like of Pearl sense of self, where there's one essential thing that gives you selfness. And instead, what he in the second chapter kind of proposes is that there's no essential sense of self. The Pearl model is wrong, and instead he advocates for what's called bundle theory, which, like, the idea is there's a bunch of characteristics to you that are bundled together, and there's no one essential element, and you're not as, let's say, your identity is very malleable and it's very context dependent, and much more context dependent than people would like to think, and that you're this sort of bundle of characteristics, and the bundle, it changes over time. You lose some sticks, you add some sticks, you lose some sticks, you add some sticks. It's a bit of a metaphor, and there's no like one central pearl. This is overall the theory he advocates for. In the second section, there are several chapters. Multiplication, the social self. So one of these is like how does our environment play into determining who we are. I think he refers to this in later chapters, but he does talk about the Zimbardo prison experiment and the Abu Ghraib kind of prison fiasco. And in the Zimbardo prison experiment, which I've done a video on, there was a Stanford experiment with all the students where some of them were assigned to be guards and some of them were assigned to be prisoners. And what it ended up happening is the guards just treated the prisoners horribly, and the prisoners like became the in other words, the people kind of just adopted to fill the roles that were assigned to them, and the guards were particularly, you know, mean to the prisoners, even though they came from the exact same backgrounds. They're all Stanford students. They get lost in the sauce of their character, or the character that is assigned to them. And Baggini's whole point in bringing this up is that our identity, like how we treat other people, is much more context dependent than what we would like to admit. And so it's, hard to say that, oh, I'm not this way or I am this way, because the context matters a lot. He talks about how also the same type of person might be really nice in common situations and then turn out to be really nasty in uncommon situations. And it's just by virtue of the common situations being common that they appear to be a nice person overall, rather than, and if their situation were different, they might be considered a far different person. And so one example might be when they're under a lot of stress, they just crack and they just become a huge a-hole. And then, but when everything's going nice, they are also very pleasant to be around. And so if they had a life where they're just under massive stress instead, they would come across as a completely different person. He then talks about, well, is identity just an illusion? And he makes this argument, and I think Bruce Hood cites, in The Self-Illusion, Bruce Hood cites Julian Baggini's book. It was written before his, and I think he lifted kind of like a lot of ideas from Julian Baggini. But he argues that our identity is an illusion of sorts. It's a construct that is made in order to help us make sense of reality and this sort of thing, but it is not merely an illusion, right? Just because something's an illusion doesn't mean it's not real. It's not real in the sense that we feel that it's real, where we have this core sense of self that is like who we are, that is immutable, and it's just not, according to like a whole variety of data points which Baggini brings up, not all of which I'm like mentioning, and not all of which I can like reconstruct the arguments for myself for him, but I'm just relaying what it's about. And then let's see, we also reconstructing character, and then part 3 is our future selves. This part's like a little more forward thinking. It's only got 3 chapters: life after death, the future of the self, and living without a soul. Which is something he talks about quite a bit, is like the idea of a soul, and if a soul makes identity, and like this sorts of things. I think that, let's get into the ratings, and then we'll kind of give more of an overview. So for utility, I give it a 3.5. This is kind of a hard book to rate the utility. This book in general is hard because it's coming from a more philosophical background, so I simultaneously really like it and also feel biased against it, in the sense that I wouldn't as broadly recommend it to other people. So utility, I give it a 3.5. I don't think it's really going to inform people's actions in a very meaningful way, other than perhaps being more understanding of people. If you think that people act a certain way because of who they are, and who they are is bad people, then you will treat people a bit differently than if you think they act the way they are because of their entire life situation, and you put the focal point of responsibility on a little bit of a different way. I think you'll treat people differently. You also might, for example, you could trust people less if they've just never been put in a tough situation, and you're just like, say, yeah, they're trustworthy, and they appear to be trustworthy, and they appear to be stand-up people, but they've just never been in a hard place. These are maybe some of the utilities you could get out of it. Also, just, I haven't put an enormous amount of thought into how having this perspective versus the Pearl theory might dramatically change the way you approach life, because I have been operating from like a bundle theory perspective for a very long time now, and so maybe this is something worth thinking about, but I think on the whole it's not going to change your behavior too much. There's a little bit stint about free will. I think believing in free will is a useful thing, even though it's determinism, from a philosophical perspective, determinism, which is like the refusal of free will, kind of looks like the better position in a lot of ways, without getting too much into free will. But like other than that, I think a lot of the ideas that are discussed in Baggini's book don't pertain much to utility, and this is also, and to the extent that they do, this is perhaps not the easiest book to read, and so it's not very efficient in terms of utility. Okay, for novelty, I gave it a 6.5. I do think that the mainstream thoughts on how identity works are just incorrect, and Baggini's perspective is just better. Although he is perhaps not definitive and more exploratory, I think would be how I'd like to describe this book. He's not like saying, this is the way identity is. He's like saying, this is an argument, this is an argument, this is an argument. This is why these first two seem wrong and this one might seem right. But, think for yourself. It's kind of more the perspective I think that he gives, which I think is correct. I'm rather a fan of the way he presents the information quite a lot, which is why I gave style of 7.5, which is quite high. Despite not having like any sort of like literary rhetorical flourishes, I found particularly impressive. I do like the way he presented the information, so that's why I gave a style of 7.5. For entertainment, I gave a 5.5. I found it entertaining. It's kind of hard to rate it too high because it's maybe not a book that is like what you would go out to read if you were trying to be entertained. But I enjoyed it, but I probably enjoy philosophy more than the next person. For readability, I gave it a 5. I'm trying to be more careful on readability. There was a book that recently that I scored like as being super readable, and then I lent it to someone who I think is pretty intelligent, and then they told me it was extremely hard to read the book, and so now I'm at a loss for like how to rate things in terms of readability. I understand that that's only like one data point in terms of like feedback, but since then I'm thinking I might be giving too high scores on readability, and so the ego tricks rather suffers a little bit from that. Me trying to readjust and tamp down. The ego trick is like it covers philosophical concepts that are relatively deep, and so it might actually be a relatively challenging read. Perhaps a readability of 5 is too high, but I think that Baggini does a really good job unpacking ideas that are potentially difficult, and I don't know that there would be a much easier way to unpack them. It's not like parsing through something that is just completely, it's not only complex, but it's poorly presented. It's parsing through something that's complex and well presented. So, that's kind of what I think. And then for interesting, I gave it an 8.5. I found it very, very interesting. This is actually my second read through, so it's obviously not as interesting the second time through, but identity's always kind of been an interesting topic to me. Like how do we forge our conceptions of self? And, having this understanding that the self is, a lot more contingent on like the environment and changes a lot over time, I think is, yeah, maybe it's more important for utility, but like I think it's an important concept to internalize because it is a concept that is necessary to be more dynamic as an individual and be able to grow over time. You have to think that you can grow over time and that you're not just stuck wherever you're at, whether wherever you're at is a really good place and you don't need to work on yourself, or wherever you're at is a bad place and you can't improve yourself. I think that it is kind of an important piece of information to get in, and I also think it's just correct. As far as recommendations go, I would not broadly recommend this book because I think it's not. I think that philosophy is not the philosophical and off the beaten path, kind of getting into the weeds, like chopping wood in the middle of nowhere type of thing that is philosophy is perhaps not for everyone. And so I would not recommend this book that widely. I think it is better than Bruce Hood's book, The Self-Illusion. But if someone wanted a book on identity and they came to me and asked, I'd probably be more likely to recommend Bruce Hood's book, The Self-Illusion. And the reason being is that I don't think Bruce Hood's book captures the problems as well, but I think it's easier to access and perhaps is more useful as a book. And so I'd be more likely to recommend it on that basis. But other than that, I think you would have to, well, it's I would probably only recommend it to people who like read a lot and are involved in, some degree of reading a lot of nonfiction, and they are trying to construct a worldview that is robust, and so that they have an interest in the way the world works and how we as people work, and so they would have to have a pretty niche, specific interest set for me to recommend it. But then if they have that, I really would recommend it. Is kind of the way I want to, you know, yeah. There's a very small sliver of people whom I would recommend this book to, but I would also very strongly recommend it to that small sliver. I think it's difficult to capture like the sort of ambivalent nature of my wanting to recommend this book. Anyways, uh, there's a sort of thing where, okay, we're gonna leave with like two things. I don't think they're in the book. I'm not sure. The first one might be in the book. Often, when a child gets injured, what they'll do is they won't immediately cry. Instead, they will turn back to their mother, and they will look to see their mother's reaction. And if their mother is horrified, the child will start crying. And if the mother is like doesn't seem to have a problem, the child will go about their day. And this like implies quite heavily that the child is gaining information from their mother. They are looking to their mother to interpret how much damage was done to their body, which is kind of this crazy like thing if you think about it, because they trust their mother's ability to evaluate the situation of their body better than themselves. There is another perspective that I think gets mentioned in the Baggini book, but it's not. It's kind of glossed over, and it's somewhat also glossed over in the Self-Illusion book by Bruce Hood, and that is this idea of we are constructing our identities based on what other people think of us. And so the idea is that it's not that you just act differently around other people and it's an inauthentic thing, but it's that you might actually just have other identities around other people. Your entire identity shifts, and it's not just a front. For example, people act way differently around their parents than they do their friends. And so I think there's a name for this model. It's called the looking glass self. And as far as discussion goes, can anyone describe a certain person or group around which they are way different, or a situation where someone was way different around them than they were like the group? One example is there are a lot of guys who are just become absolute comedians when a girl's around, and then when a girl's not around, they're like way different. Anyways, if you enjoy this video and want to see more, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. If you have a recommendation for a book, feel free to put it in the comments, and have a good day.